Okay, so I'm delighted to have been joined by Mary Robinson, who is the founder of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice and also, of course, the former President of Ireland. Mary, perhaps I should start by asking you what you're doing at the climate talks here and also what your foundation's doing.
Well, I was in Copenhagen, of course, and I link with Oxfam as honorary president of Oxfam, but I was also there for Realising Rights, because we were coming to climate from a human rights perspective very strongly because of our work in African countries. And Realising Rights was planned to end in December, which we will. And I had been thinking about what to do when I returned to Ireland. And to me, the climate issue is the most compelling human rights issue of the 21st century. And people look at me when I say that, isn't it conflict, isn't it the rights in China? No, this is it. Because already it's destroying the human rights of a lot of people, rights to food and safe water. It's going to be the source of conflicts. And so I decided to establish a foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, linked with the two main universities in Ireland, linked with all the NGOs in Ireland, linked with Irish Aid, and actually have my country become a bridge country on climate justice. Ireland, is a good country to do that.
And what was it that initially got you kind of motivated and desperate to be involved in this issue?
Well, I've been very passionate about human rights issues, and our work in Realising Rights focused mainly on economic and social rights, right to health, decent work, women's leadership in peace and security, business and human rights. And cutting across all of those was the fact that weather was worsening the situation of the poorest, undermining subsistence farmers, undermining indigenous. And we marched for climate justice in Copenhagen, and I became of the view we need to do more than march. We need to actually make it central, change the narrative about climate, and make it about people and about gender and about the kind of issues that happily are beginning to surface here in Cancun.
And you mentioned changing this narrative and the role of climate justice. What does climate justice mean to you?
Climate justice links climate change, human rights and development. We had the Brundtland report, which gave us sustainable development, but Brundtland didn't envisage that the lifestyles of the rich parts of the world, based on carbon, profligate overuse of carbon, would undermine the vulnerable life chances of the poorest. So we need to revisit the notion of sustainable development with the idea of climate justice. It also increases the advocacy. People get it, actually. They understand. When Constance O'Kellett tells her story about the way that climate has undermined her community in northern Uganda, and then she says, "We thought God wanted to punish us." And then she was contacted by Oxfam and became a climate witness. And now she says it wasn't God, it was rich people who were punishing us. The lifestyles of rich people. So that connects on a people level. And it also means that people ask, well, what do you do about the justice? It's not a justice that you primarily go into court. There probably will be some litigation and should be on certain aspects. But it's a developmental justice. And the way in which you bring about the justice is to have affordable, renewable energy for all, which means the 1.5 billion or 1.4 billion who have no access to electricity, the 1.7 billion women who cook on firewood and animal dung and ingest smoke that affects their lungs and also destroy trees, etc.
I noticed yesterday in a statement you made, you drew a parallel with mobile phones and the boom in mobile phones in Africa. But before working on our climate change initiative, I was actually lucky enough to support some of our own work with mobiles in Africa, and so I've seen firsthand how they've boomed and the role they're playing. Do you think there's a similar potential for renewable energy to boom in Africa, and how can rich countries support this kind of process?
I've thought about that quite a bit. The mobile phone is such a productive instrument, for everything, transmitting money, looking at markets, health surveillance, education, etc. So as soon as a poor person has it, it's productive. Whereas a solar light in the home lights the home, and it takes a while, the children do their homework, the mother can cook, but it's not productive. So I think we're going to need public-private partnerships initially that actually have built into them some kind of subsidizing, so that the poor can get the first, lighting in the home, preferably solar battery if they're off-grid, clean cooking and water purification in a subsidized way, and then they will be more productive with their mobile phones, and the next time they buy it. So it's, I chair an alliance, a public-private partnership, the Gavi Alliance, for immunizing poor children. What that did was create a market for the immunization of the poorest children. And we have to keep doing it because the poorest countries do some co-financing, but they could never afford to get the vaccines and get them out to the poorest children without Gavi. So it's a halfway between Gavi continuing the market and having short-term public-private partnerships.
And you've mentioned the responsibility of rich countries, and I noticed also that you've said that you see climate change as an opportunity for new values and a change in our lifestyles. How do you think we can go about shifting people's values, and do you see that happening already in the world?
It's not happening enough, but what encourages me is young people get it. You know, young people are now telling their parents to start recycling because they're somehow picking it up in school, picking it up on the internet, and you have more green schools. You've more. Tomorrow I'll be with young people here in Cancun under UNICEF and CARE, bringing them together. And there's nothing that I can tell them. They actually know it better than I do. And I think that's the hope, that it'll take a little while. And meanwhile, those of us who have bad habits like me have to change those habits painfully. But hopefully young people will actually grow into good habits. And it's not that they won't have a reasonable life. In fact, they'll have a better values life, and that's a good thing. And in the meantime, we have to remember that the poor have a right to development. And if we don't help them to have a good renewable energy development, they can have a messy carbon development. It's their right. And I don't think anybody should take that, other than they have a right to development. It's in our interests to make sure that it's renewable, because that's where the bulge of population is. That's where we go up to the 9 billion. And we cannot keep below, down to the 1.5, or at least well below a threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, unless we provide renewable energy to that bulk of people who are coming into our world.
And drawing on this rights perspective, the Bolivians have proposed an international court of climate justice. Is this an idea that you would support? And if so, how can we engage the UN with this process? What would be the best tactics for engaging the UN?
I'm certainly interested and would encourage diverse ways of coming forward, and it may well be that a climate tribunal is needed. The priority, as far as I'm concerned, is a developmental justice at this stage. That we put far more emphasis on adaptation and a strong gender dimension on adaptation because of the justice of that, and that we provide the transfer of technology of new energies. It may well be that there's cause for some litigation or a climate tribunal, but that won't change the lot of the millions that are at the forefront of Oxfam's concern, Tick Tick Tick's concern, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice's concern.
And we dedicated the entirety of our live show on Friday to the role and impact of women and girls associated with climate change. And it was really evident there about the strong leadership that women are showing around the world. But that doesn't seem to be reflected here in the UN talks. The vast majority of the delegates are men, and certainly the lead negotiators are men. Is that likely to impact our chances for a fair deal, do you think?
Well, what I was pleased to be able to do with my foundation, and also Realising Rights and Wangari Maathai's Centre and the Nobel Women, was to have a meeting, actually immediately after I arrived in Cancun last Saturday evening, of grassroots women, indigenous women, the NGOs like WIDO and the Large and the Gender CC, all coming together to talk about women being agents of change at grassroots level. And then today we were able to convene women ministers, and we had the 6 women ministers coming. Patricia Espinola, the chair of the conference itself, Christiana Figueres, Connie Hedegaard of the Commission, the Danish minister, the minister from Ecuador, and those ministers came prepared. We had a great platform. We had a huge audience of women, including young girls, listening. And I think that has actually made a difference. They've committed to a sort of troika plus between Denmark last year with a woman minister, Mexico with a woman minister, and South Africa with a woman minister, and any other women ministers who want to come in. They've committed to a website to continue this dialogue, and they've committed to, the kind of real sense that gender must be in the forefront, and we must have a more people-centered approach. So, I agree with you that we haven't seen enough, though there are more meetings about gender. I'm going to one about the green economy and women tomorrow, and there have been ones on RED and women. So, but I think this was an opportunity to link women ministers with grassroots women leaders in a way that was respectful of both. And I hope it will make a difference over the next few days on the climate fund in particular.
And just before we wrap up, Ireland's currently right at the heart of a global economic crisis. Yeah. Do you see that impacting these talks at the moment? And how should we best navigate this crisis and ensure that climate change doesn't get left by the wayside as an issue?
Well, certainly the economic crisis is hitting Ireland really very badly. I've been quite shocked myself at how serious it is. At the same time, I'm glad I'm going back, because now it's the time to go back and help to move forward again. And I was very pleased that, notwithstanding the severity of the economic crisis, Ireland has made its contribution to the Fast Start Fund. And I think it's over 20 million, not sure exactly how much, but in the current climate, that is a good signal in my view.
And then I just want to ask you finally, as somebody with experience of these international negotiations and who's familiar with the process, perhaps for our viewers who often find the progress slow and find that very frustrating, does the process here leave you optimistic? Are you able to look at what's happening here at the UN and come away feeling that we can really achieve something here?
It's true that it seems slow. This is the 16th conference of the parties, but then we're trying to change our values, our behaviour, our use of energy, huge implications. We're trying to have a fair deal, and it's only in a UN context that small voices get heard. These small islands where people are afraid that they're going to lose their whole habitat and where their ancestors are buried, the gender perspective, the indigenous, the need to be able to be fair, which we're not yet in the discussions. So having worked for 5 years within the UN system as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I often borrow an expression of Winston Churchill about democracy. Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst system except for all the others. And I think that the UN is the worst system, but it's the only one we have. And actually we have to make it work, because if we do, we'll get a fairer deal. It takes longer, but I'm more encouraged by the practical building blocks that we're focusing on here in Cancun. Copenhagen was really disappointing because there were high expectations. There weren't really very high expectations for Cancun, and with any luck, we'll at least meet those, maybe even go a bit better and reaffirm this process leading to Durban next year in South Africa.
Well, I think that's an optimistic and a nice note to leave it on, so I'll just say thank you very much for joining us. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Okay, thanks. Great. Okay.